The Dope Kabbalah and the Wall of Fire. Chapter 19. They get to drinking and smoking pot and popping them pills. In their mouths. Hell, absolutely anything can happen. They get into a kind of frenzy, like animals, and they'll tear you to bits with chains, knives, beer can openers, anything they can get their hands on. Fontana Detective. Motorcycle outlaws have been accused of maintaining a dope network, a sinister web of sales and deliveries from one coast to the other. Federal narcotics agents say the Hells Angels shipped more than $1 million worth of marijuana from Southern California to New York City between 1962 and 65, sending it by air freight in boxes labeled motorcycle parts. That is a lot of grass, even at street corner retail prices. The network was exposed in late 1965 when, according to the Los Angeles Times, 8 persons who identified themselves as members of the Hells Angels pleaded guilty in a San Diego court to charges of smuggling 150 pounds of marijuana from Mexico into the United States at San Isidro. The convicted smugglers had little, if anything, to do with the Angels, despite their alleged claims to membership. 3 of the 8 were from New York, and of the 5 from Los Angeles, 2 were girls. That left only 3 who could possibly have been angels. But the outlaws I talked to said they'd never heard of them. Perhaps they lied. But I doubt it. Normally they are proud to be connected with anything that makes headlines. Which is beside the point. Really. Because 150 pounds of pot is only a fraction of what crosses the Mexican border every week. Despite the sharp-eyed zeal of U.S. custom officials. These gentlemen hate dope like they hate sin. And when they're after it, they know who to grab. Beatnik perverts and hairy sandal freaks. People with beards are shaken down thoroughly. I have crossed the border at Tijuana more than a dozen times, but the only time I was stopped and searched was after a week of skin diving off Baja California, when 3 of us tried to get back into the States with a week's growth of hair on our faces. At the border, we were asked the standard questions, gave the standard replies, and were instantly seized. We were asked the standard questions and gave the standard replies. And were instantly seized. The customs agent took our truck, full of camping and scuba gear, into a special shed and picked over it for an hour and a half. They found several bottles of liquor, but no dope. They couldn't seem to believe it. They kept feeling the sleeping bags and groping under the chassis. Finally, they let us go with a warning to be more careful in the future. Meanwhile, out on the highway, the big volume dope runners were being waved through with a smile. They were wearing neckties and business suits, driving late model rent-a-cars with electric razor attachments. I didn't notice any outlaw motorcyclists roaring up to the border, but if any had appeared, they'd have been jerked into the shed for a thorough shakedown. People who make a living smuggling narcotics into the states, operate on the same principle as bad check artists, who do not, as a rule, wear beards, earrings, and swastikas. Because of the head waiter mentality that prevails among customs officials, no commercial shipper of marijuana or anything else illegal would make the mistake of using Hell's Angels for runners. It would be like sending a car up to the border with Opium Express printed in red letters on both sides. If the God of the righteous could swoop down one night and char every Hell's Angel to ashes, marijuana traffic on the Mexican border would hardly be phased. In February 1966, 3 men in a stolen truck passed through customs with more than a half ton of marijuana, 1,050 pounds in one load. They got it all the way to Los Angeles, where they were arrested several days later on an anonymous tip, which netted the tipster close to $100,000 in reward money. The Angels are too obvious for serious drug traffic. They don't even have enough capital to function as middlemen, so they end up buying most of their stuff in small lots at high prices. 3 or 4 of them will nurse a joint until it is so short that they have to hold it with alligator clips, which many outlaws carry for exactly this purpose. People with real access to marijuana can afford to smoke it in big pipes and hookahs. And if they have a serious commercial interest in the stuff, they rarely smoke it at all, except behind locked doors. A taste for pot is not part of the formula for success in a profit-oriented society. If Horatio Alger had been born near a field of local weed, his story might have been a lot different. He would have gone on unemployment and spent most of his time just standing around, smiling at things, brushing off the protests of his friends and benefactors, saying, "Don't bug me, baby. You'll never know." The Angels insists there are no dope addicts in the club. And by legal or medical definitions, this is true. Addicts are focused. The physical need for whatever they're hooked on forces them to be selective. But the Angels have no focus at all. They gobble drugs like victims of famine turned loose on a rare smorgasbord. They use anything available, and if the result is a screaming delirium, then so be it. They smoke marijuana so openly that it's hard to understand why they're not all in jail for it. California's marijuana laws are among the most primitive manifestations of American politics. 2 convictions for possession of a single joint, or even a tenth of one, will send a person to prison for a minimum of 2 years. A 3rd conviction for possession means a minimum of 5 years. These sentences are fixed by law, regardless of any circumstances a judge might find to be mitigating. Except for the risk, the marijuana situation in California is a lot like the booze situation in the 1920s. Pot is everywhere. Thousands of people smoke it as often as they take aspirins. But the fact of illegality has bred a cultishness, a pot underground, whose partisans are forced to skulk around like spies, convening in dark rooms to pass their criminal pleasure from hand to nervous hand. Many get high from the sheer risk. Few people can turn on without making a very spooky ordeal of it. But among those who do are the Hells Angels, who have done it for so long and so often that they no longer confuse the mystique with the real effects. Marijuana seems to relax them, but not much else. They refer to it as weed or dope, shunning such hipster terminology as grass and pot. Most just take it for granted, as they do beer and wine. If the stuff is available, they'll smoke it, but they rarely spend money for it. When they have to pay for kicks, they prefer something with more velocity. At Bass Lake, it was pills. Soon after dark on Saturday, I was standing with a group of angels by the bonfire, talking about the Laconia riot, when somebody appeared with a big plastic bag and began passing out handfuls of whatever it contained. When my turn came, I held out my hand and received about 30 small white pills. For a moment, the talk ceased, while the outlaws gulped down their rations, chasing the pills with beer. I asked what they were, and somebody beside me said, "Cartwheels, man. Bennies. Eat some. They'll keep you going." I asked him what they were in milligrams, but he didn't know. "Just take about 10, he advised. "And if that don't work, take more." I nodded and ate 2. They looked to be about 5 milligrams each, which is enough Benzedrine to keep most people awake and jabbering for several hours. 10 pills or 50 milligrams will send anybody but a pill freak to the hospital with symptoms of acute delirium tremens. Later, several angels assured me that their bennies were indeed 5s. At least that's what they were paying for. They never quoted their wholesale price, but they once offered to give me a break on as many as I wanted. At the rate of $53 a thousand, or about twice what the same pills would cost me in a drugstore with a prescription. It turned out that they were not even 5s, but more like 1s. When I realized that the first 2 were having no effect, I took several more, and then more. By dawn, I had eaten 12, which, if they'd been honest, would have caused me to gnaw down trees like a beaver. As it was, they only helped me to stay on my feet about 4 hours longer than I would have otherwise. The next day, I told the outlaws they were being cheated, but they shrugged it off. "We got no choice," said one. "If you buy stuff on the black market, you gotta take whatever you get. Who gives a damn anyway? If they're weak, all you gotta do is take more. We're not gonna run out." Bennies, cartwheels, or whites are basic to the outlaw diet, like weed, beer, and wine. But when they talk about getting wasted, the action moves on to another level. The next step up the scale is seconal reds, or red devils, a barbiturate normally used as a sedative or tranquilizer. They also take Amatil, Blue Heaven, Nembutal, Yellow Jackets, and Tuinol. But they prefer the reds, which they take along with beer and bennies to keep from getting sleepy. The combination brews up some hellish effect. Barbiturates and alcohol can be a fatal mixture, but the outlaws combine enough stimulants with their depressants to at least stay alive, if not rational. A righteous angel loading up on a run will consume almost anything, and in any quantity, combination, or sequence. I recall a 2-day party many months after Bass Lake, at which Terry began the first day with beer, had a stick of grass at noon, then more beer, and another joint for dinner, then to red wine and a handful of bennies to keep awake, more grass in the middle of the evening, along with a red for some odd feeling, then all through the night more beer, wine, bennies, and another red to get some rest, before taking off again for another 20 hours on the same diet, but this time with a pint of bourbon and 500 micrograms of LSD to ward off any possibility of boredom setting in. This is a pretty extreme diet, and not all of the angels can handle the whole spectrum of stimulation, depression, hallucinations, drunkenness, and wipe out fatigue for 48 hours at a time. Most try to stick with limited combinations, such as beer, pot, and seconal, or gin, beer and bennies, or wine and LSD. But if you will go the whole route, and on top of everything else, shoot some methadone or DMT, and turn into total zombies for hours at a time. 20. The only way we can stop this is to arrest Los Angeles Police Chief William Parker, since deceased, on the subject of Negro riots. The possibility of a Hells Angels dope network brings up once again the old bugaboo of expansion. Are the Angels spreading east? According to the New York Daily News, the dirty buggers have already made the leap. One night, when the mist was on the river, they boomed through the toll gates on the George Washington Bridge, chain whipping a gatekeeper, who noticed that their saddlebags were full of dope and sex instruments. The news broke the story with a screaming headline, "Terror on Wheels." They're a motorcycle mob called Hells Angels, and they get their kicks from sex and violence. Above the headline was a picture of Tiny laughing in the grip of 3 Berkeley policemen. The caption beneath it said that bearded Tiny, blood streaming from his wrist, was clubbed down during a brawl that erupted last week when free-swinging Angels took on Vietnam protest marchers. Towering Tiny and 2 others were jailed, and a cop suffered a broken leg in melee. The caption must have got scrambled with one from a beauty slashes self dies story on another page. There is no other explanation for the strange line about blood streaming from wrist. Whose wrist? The picture shows 3 wrists, but none bleeding. And why is Tiny laughing? Is he hysterical after slashing his wrists at a Vietnam protest? If so, why was it necessary to club him? Which cop had a broken leg? And why are the others smiling? The photo was very unsettling, but the one below it was even more so, especially to the Angels. It showed 4 neatly dressed subjects being booked in Greenwich Village for stabbing an AWOL Marine. They looked no different from anyone else who might be arrested in the village for stabbing a Marine, except that all 4 were wearing jackets with Hells Angels lettered on the back. There was no emblem, no death's head, no class at all, and yet they claimed to be Hells Angels. The account of their arrest was a model of police blotter journalism. Several hours later, the crime the four had been arrested. Quite by coincidence, said the news, at the same hospital where the victim Marine was being treated. Several hours after the crime, the 4 had been arrested. Quite by coincidence, said the news, at the same hospital where the victim Marine was being treated. I just wandered in, jacketed, booted, and wearing telltale gold earrings, to see about having a cyst removed from the neck of one of them. This immediately established a motive with a prime suspect, the man with the cyst. It was pressing on the tail of his medulla, causing great pain. After enduring it as long as possible, he lost control of himself and stabbed a passing Marine. Then the whole pack ran aimlessly through the village for several hours, like a family of hyenas, until they found themselves in front of the hospital, which they decided to enter, and have done with the fiendish cyst that had caused all the trouble in the first place. Police quickly took them into custody, said the news, and found knives. The police said, on all 4. 2 were identified as being involved in the stabbing, and all were held on weapons charges. None of the 4 had motorcycles, except for the lettering on their backs. They looked like a bowling team from the Bronx. Then came the shocker. Brazenly, the 4 announced they had come to town to shake up New York, and that 15 to 24 other Angels were also roaming around the city. No doubt the others went underground, for they were never mentioned again in the Terror on Wheels story or anywhere else. After placing the terror in Manhattan, the news gave a dull summation of time in Newsweek rumors, selections from the Lynch Report, and old newspaper clippings. The article made it clear, however, that 15 to 24 Hells Angels were loose somewhere in Manhattan. And maybe they were. With a little luck, they might have located one of the half-dozen opium dens that specialize in cyst reduction. In the news, if the news had put two and two together, they would have known who caused the great power blackout that autumn. It was a Hells Angels plot to take over the subway system and triple the fares. After weeks of intricate sabotage and recruiting and recircuiting the power rails, the outlaws were attempting a final tie-off under the Yale Club when one of their number, afflicted with bad hives, was overcome by abulia and wired the main subway voltage to the root of the Empire State Building's lightning rod. The resulting explosion killed them all. But their bones were carried off by water rats, and there was no other evidence. As usual, the Angels beat their rap, and the news missed a hell of a story. Hells Angels face prison for NH Cycle Rampage. New York Post, June 1965. The New York power failure was not the first time the Hells Angels have confounded the forces of decency and got off scot-free. They are incredibly devious. Law enforcement officers have compared their guile to that of the snipe, a wily beast that many have seen, but few have ever trapped. This is because the snipe has the ability to transform himself, when facing capture, into something entirely different. The only other animal capable of this are the werewolf and the Hells Angels. The Hells Angel, which have many traits in common. The physical resemblance is obvious, but far more important is the transmogrification factor. Transmogrification factor. The strange ability to alter their own physical structure, and hence disappear. The Hells Angels are very close-mouthed about this, but it is a well-known fact among public officials. One of the best examples of how it can work showed up in the Laconia, New Hampshire motorcycle riot in June of 1965. Which got more publicity than any other single event in the history of motorcycling. It was front page from coast to coast. The New York Times headline said, "Cyclists riot quelled. New Hampshire town cleans up." In San Francisco, the Examiner put a little more zip to it. Hells Angels terror at NH cycle races. Cops guard slug rioters. The number of terrorists ranged from 5,000 in the New York Post to 25,000 in the National Observer, but 20,000 more or less didn't seem to make much difference. Everybody agreed it was a wild and woolly bash. The mayor of the stricken hamlet, a 35-year-old patriot named Peter Lassard, blamed the whole thing on the Hells Angels. He said they had planned it in advance and trained in Mexico for the riot. On Monday, 2 days after the melee, Laconia's leading citizens gathered in the Tavern Hotel to hear the mayor explain what had happened. According to Lessard and Safety Commissioner Robert Rhodes, the Hells Angels threw a ring around the whole area. They wouldn't let anybody get away. The thing blew up in our faces in minutes. There was some marijuana around, too. Are the communists behind it? Reporters picked up the quote with thinly veiled amusement, but it was at least a month before the initial wild-eyed accounts of the Laconia riot were deflated by first-hand testimony from those without instant access to print. Even the Life article, on careful reading, indicated that many of the rioters acted in self-defense when police and National Guardsmen launched an all-out indiscriminate attack with tear gas, bayonets, nightsticks, and shotguns, firing rock salt and number 6 birdshot. Many of those arrested in the mop-up didn't own or ride motorcycles, and a fellow named Samuel Sadowski was sentenced to a year in jail after being arrested in a parking lot where there was no sign of rioting. According to an eyewitness, Sadowski's only offense was a hasty retreat from the line of fire. The police used full-bore riot tactics, which they'd been practicing for more than 2 months. The local police chief, Harold Knowlton, had called up 200 National Guardsmen, 60 state troopers, and 10 civil defense volunteers, in addition to his own force of 28 regulars. We practiced for 10 weeks in crowd control and riot tactics, said the chief. But we did it undercover. We didn't want to challenge them. Sure enough, he didn't. The small army he trained was only for symbolic purposes, just like the Hells Angels. They don't want to challenge people either, but they manage to get provoked pretty often. One report of the riot quoted a local saying, "Luckily, there happened to be some National Guardsmen training nearby. If it hadn't been for them, the town would have been a gutted ruin. And there's no way of telling how many of our women would have been gang raped, how many of our citizens might have been killed by those rotten bums on motorcycles. Thank God for the troops." The Lord was taking good care of Laconia that night. His troops came in and shot hell out of the place. One of the most critically injured was a photographer named Robert St. Louis, who was shot in the face while trying to take pictures. On the 70 reported injuries, 69 were on the enemy side. Life quoted a 17-year-old boy as saying, "They yanked me out of the car and knocked me bow-legged. Then one cop stood on my head while another put me in put handcuffs on." Even the featured victim of the riot, a barber named Armand Barron, whose car was burned by rioters, attributed his injuries to the forces of the Almighty. While trying to flee, he was hit in the mouth by police Billy and slammed on the hip by a guardsman's rifle butt. The Laconia riot was one of the most predictable outbursts in the history of civil chaos. The main event of that weekend was either the 44th annual New England Tour and Rally, as reported in Life, or the 26th running of the New England motorcycle races, according to the National Observer. Other promoters had different names for it. The AMA called it a 100-mile national championship road race. But by any other name, by any name, it was a huge traditional motorcycle gathering. Non-racing cyclists know it as the New England Gypsy Tour, And it is one of those scenes they all like to make. The idea is about the same as any Hells Angels run, but on a much bigger scale. Laconia, with a population of 15,000 in the winter and 45,000 in the summer, attracts anywhere from 15 to 30,000 motorcyclists for the race weekend. They have been an annual event since 1939, a year after the Belknap Gunstock Recreation Area was built outside Laconia as a winter ski run and summer campground. William Schettinger from nearby Concord is a founder of both the American Motorcycle Association and the Laconia Races. The races were not held in 1964 because of a riot the previous year. Anybody who knows anything about the event could predict to the hour that a riot would take place again, said Warren Warner, manager of the county-owned Belknap area. They rioted here before, but nobody saw it because it was away from town. We had 70 local and state police here, but they took a look at the mob and decided not to do anything at all. The cyclists threw cherry bombs, swung knives and chains, and threw beer cans at the police. We had fires started, buildings burned, the chairlift started in the middle of the night and wrecked, and picnic tables chopped up for kindling. The people in town who wanted those races weren't around and didn't want to be around. I tried to discuss the riots with them, but there was always the rebuttal that nobody saw them, so what's the difference? In 1964, a new racetrack was built outside Laconia's jurisdiction, and the event was on again for 1965. The Laconia Chamber of Commerce was enthusiastic enough to contribute $5,000 to the promotional fund, which was, after all, a pretty good investment, since the Chamber of Commerce estimates the motorcyclists spend between $250,000 and $500,000 in the area during the weekend of the races. That sounds like a lot, but considering the number of cyclists, it's only $25 to $50 each, most of which goes to motels, souvenir shops, beer joints, and hamburger stands. Mayor Lessard says the event has always been a good start to the tourist season, and that the economy suffered in 1964 when the races were suspended. Former Mayor Gerald Morin, a beer distributor in Laconia, estimates that some 15,000 cases of beer were sold to cyclists during the 1965 weekend. Obviously, the races are good for our economy, he said in the wake of the riot. We shouldn't be making any decisions now that emotions are high. We should wait until they cool down. At the same time, Mayor Lessard put it more bluntly. Even the people who want the races may have had some doubts until they deposited their cash in the banks. Fritzie Bear, a publicist for the New England Motorcycle Dealers Association, which sponsors the races, threw weight of his prestige on the side of the mayor and the beer distributor. I believe when we get through this year, the bad element won't come back. I know in my heart the bad element won't come back to the state of New Hampshire after they've seen how we deal with them. Mr. Bear did not define the bad element, but presumably it did not include anyone likely to purchase motorcycles in New England. In any case, some of them were dealt with rather harshly. Under the provisions of a new riot law that United Press International reported was rushed through the state legislature only a week before the Laconia races. It provides for fines up to $1,000 and imprisonment up to 3 years for persons who lead a disturbance or cause personal property damage during a riot. Under the old law, the maximum fine was $25. Contrary to rumors, at the time of its enactment, the new law contained no provisions for punishment by dunking stool. Even as the law was being passed, telephone poles on highways near Laconia were festooned with signs saying, "Come to the riot. See Weir's Beach burn Saturday night." Weir's Beach is a lakeside strip outside the town, with water on one side, and taverns, penny arcades, and bowling alleys on the other. By 9 o'clock Saturday night, Lakeside Avenue, the main street, was thronged with some 4,000 beer-drinking tourists, about half riding motorcycles. Crowds began appearing on rooftops above the arcade area, and police heard the shout go up, "Let's have a riot!" It was about this time that Mr. Barron drove his car, for some excellent reason, no doubt, right down Lakeside and into the middle of the mob. He'd gone out for a ride, he explained later, taking his wife, his son's wife, and the 2 grandchildren. Dwan, 2, and Brenda, 8 months old. By the time Mr. Barron began creeping down the crowded street, the action was getting out of hand. People were throwing beer cans down from the rooftops. Police claimed somebody had chained the fire call boxes and cut the phone lines to police headquarters. Although this would hardly have seemed necessary, the police did not need telephones to hear 5,000 people chanting, "Sieg Heil," while somebody climbed up to hang a swastika on a beachfront flagpole. Then the mob began rocking cars back and forth, including Mr. Barron's car, which was right in their midst. Barron got his family out, none of them injured, and watched his car roll over and begin burning when one of the rioters threw a match in the spilled gasoline. The flames lit up the street just about the time the National Guard arrived on the scene, with fixed bayonets and rifle butts swinging. With them came local gendarmes, firing shotguns. The mob scattered, many of them blinded by tear gas bombs. The police were pelted with firecrackers, rocks, and beer cans, but they were wearing helmets, and their 10 weeks of training served them well. According to Chief Knowlton, the riot area was cleared in 15 minutes, but it took another hour to get the side streets cleared out. The secondary action involved the rounding up of suspects. There are photos of people being clubbed off motorcycles, prodded out of sleeping bags with bayonets, and according to Associated Press, police even rousted people registered in hotels. Anyone reading the next day's headlines would have thought the whole Laconia area was an ash pile, with ragged survivors shooting at each other from behind the charred remains of automobiles. But this was not exactly the case. The state of martial law that had been declared on Saturday night was ended in time by Sunday's final racing events, which proceeded without incident. Liquor and beer sales, which had been halted during the riot, were also renewed. On Sunday morning, there were reports of a naked man picketing on Lakeside Avenue with a large sign saying, "Honey soit qui mal y pense." Okay, Malipines. Mayor Lassard spent most of Sunday investigating the riot, and by Monday he was able to report it had been communist-inspired and of Mexican origin, with the Hells Angels doing the legwork. The mayor, the police chief, and the local safety commissioner agreed that the Hells Angels had caused all the trouble. They had been plotting it for months. But they won't come back, vowed the safety commissioner. And if they do, we'll just have to be ready for them, like we were this time. After all, nobody was killed or maimed, and property damage amounted to only a few $1,000s at most. Other merchants agreed. I think the cyclist will be invited back, said the owner of the Winnipasuki Gardens dance hall at Weir's Beach. The president of the Laconia National Bank said the riot had been caused by a small minority that had been taught a good lesson and wouldn't try it again. One of the few dissenting voices in town was that of Warren Warner, who supervised the races for more than 15 years when they were at the old track in Belknap. The apologists will wait about 6 months or so, he predicted. Then they'll start planting the idea that the riots were caused by police brutality or the Hells Angels gang from California, and that they can be controlled. But listen, in that crowd of 20,000 cyclists, there are 2,000 who are no better than animals. There would not have been a riot whether or not any one club decided to come or not. There would have been a riot whether or not any one club decided to come or not. A local journalist, not allied with the beer and hamburger industries, put it more dramatically. The cyclists would have burned down the Weirs if they'd really wanted to. Maybe next time they will. Laconia is like a town playing Russian roulette. 5 times out of 6 it pulls the trigger and nothing much happens. The 6th time it blows its brains out. This does not jibe with the mayor's theory of foul winds from faraway places. Everyone seems to agree that something Russian had been in the air tonight. But I was curious about the Mexican influence and the role of the Hells Angels. Actually, I couldn't believe the mayor had said the things he was quoted as saying when he analyzed the riot. They were too absurd. So I decided to call him and check not only his words, but random facts such as the number of arrests. For some reason, it was impossible for the press to divine how many alleged rioters had been arrested. This is usually a factor in crime stories, and in most cases, it is an easy thing to find out. There is nothing interpretive about it. No hues or shadings. It is simply a number that anybody can get from the desk sergeant. If not immediately, then at least within 24 hours of the action. Most reporters assume the desk sergeant's figures are accurate, for he is the man who makes the entries in the big ledger. Yet, 8 different articles on Laconia carried 7 different versions of the arrest total. Here is a list I made a week after the riot. New York Times, about 50. Associated Press, at least 75. San Francisco Examiner via UPI, at least 100, including 5 Hells Angels. New York Herald Tribune, 29. Life, 34. National Observer, 34. New York Daily News, more than 100. New York Post, at least 40. No doubt there is an explanation for this disparity, but since it never emerged, it was not much consolation to anyone who had to make do with the public prints. I was not surprised that the 8 articles gave 8 different viewpoints on the riot, because no reporter can be on every scene, and they get their information from different people. But it would have been reassuring to find a majority agreement on something as basic as the number of arrests. It would have made the rest of the information easier to live with. 7 weeks after the riot, on August 11th, The Associated Press finally put the correct figure on its wire, but by that time nobody gave a damn, and as far as I know, it was never printed. Laconia District Court records show 32 arrests. There were no Hells Angels, no Californians, and no persons from west of the Adirondacks. The clerk of the court listed 11 respondents from Massachusetts, 10 from Connecticut, 4 from New York, 3 from Canada, 3 from New Jersey, and 1 from New Hampshire. Of these, 7 drew 1-year sentences in the State House of Correction, and 1 got 6 months. There were 10 fines, ranging from $25 to $500. Charges against 12 of the accused were dropped. 1 was found innocent, and 11 of those found guilty made appeals. Mayor Lessard was kind enough to have the court send me these figures. They came as a mild surprise, because during our telephone chat, the mayor had said that 33 rioters had been fined and sentenced, and that the bad ones with previous records got $1,000 fines and a year in jail. He also sent me a packet of photographs taken during the riot, but none showed any sign of the Hells Angels. Most pictured teenage boys wearing bright sweaters, chinos, and loafers. They were faring badly at the hands of riot troopers. The mayor also included photos of himself and the police chief, taken with a Polaroid camera, but they quickly turned yellow and faded away. We talked on the phone for about an hour. One Thursday morning, I was so fascinated that I couldn't hang up. The mayor spoke in a very exotic way. It was obvious that he was a man who marched through life to the rhythms of some drum I would never hear. I expected a denial of the strange intelligence attributed to him by the New York Times, but no. He was proud of his insights and eager to be quoted further. I had no sooner mentioned the Hells Angels than he began to ramble about ringleaders, communists, and narcotics. He was privy to information that 4 Hells Angels had been arrested in Connecticut en route to Laconia with a carload of drugs, hand weapons, and a sawed-off shotgun. He was not sure whether these 4 had trained south of the border. I'd rather not say where we got the information that they trained in Mexico, he said. It was confidential. It came in the mail. But I turned it over to the FBI right away. They're following up on the communist angle. We got some pictures of them wearing swastikas. When I asked him how many Hells Angels had been arrested, he said none, or none that admitted it anyway. Not even those 4 bums in Connecticut would admit to being angels. At one point, somebody in Laconia had seen a car with California plates, but it too had disappeared. About halfway through our talk, I got a strong whiff of the transmogrification factor, but I was hardly prepared for the mayor's special fillip on it. There were plenty of Hells Angels at the riot, but they escaped, he explained, behind a wall of fire. While he elaborated on this, I checked my calendar to make sure I hadn't lost track of the days. It was Sunday. Perhaps he had just come back from church in a high biblical state of mind. At any moment, I expected to hear that the angels had driven their motorcycles straight into the sea, which had rolled back to let them pass. But no, it wasn't like that. The mayor was not loath to give details on the escape. He wanted law enforcement agencies everywhere to be warned of the angels' methods. Knowledge is power, he opined. So Mayor Lessard described for me, in what sounded like sober tones, how the Hells Angels, prior to the riot, had soaked a major egress road with gasoline. And then, at the height of the violence, just as they were about to be arrested, they roared out of town at great speed. And the last one to cross the soak dropped a match on it. A sheet of flame exploded in the night, making pursuit impossible. Yes, it was the old firewall technique, a legacy of the Boer War. It was highly successful in Laconia. The lawmen were stopped in their tracks by heat so intense that it presumably scrambled the crystals of their shortwave radio transmitters. Had the Hells Angels been any less clever, they might have been intercepted by means of a general alert somewhere between New Hampshire and California. As it was, they made it back safely, and with plenty of time to shake the cross-country dust out of their clothes for the Bass Lake Run just 2 weeks later. There's no denying the wizardry of it, and when the clan came together, it was a prime topic of conversation. Everybody wanted to congratulate the Hardys who had pulled it off, but for some reason nobody spoke up. The only angel who knew anything about Laconia than what the others had read in the newspapers was Tiny, whose ex-wife had called him from a Laconia telephone booth at the height of the action. One of the low points of the Bass Lake Run was Tiny's rueful declaration that no angels had made it to Laconia. My old lady was right there, he told the disappointed outlaws. And if any one of our people were there, she'd have told me. Those guys from Quebec were the ones. Them and a bunch called Bandidos from the east. They showed real class. We should get together with those guys. This news caused the others to stare balefully at the fire. Finally, somebody grunted, "Shit, that was a bunch of amateurs. If we'd been there, they would have busted it up. They wouldn't have busted it up so easy." Man, 15,000 bikes in one town. I tell you, it hurts my mind. After the first wild stories were scaled down, nobody even in respectable motorcycle circles thought the Hells Angels had anything to do with the Laconia trouble. Cycle World, which calls itself America's leading motorcycle enthusiasts publication, blamed French-Canadian outlaws, refugees from the scabby side of motorcycling in the eastern United States, and radical crackpots, some of whom are in public offices in town around Laconia.